Hi folks, and welcome to episode 24 of the Epochs of the Lotus Eaters, where we'll be probably making this the last episode about the 100 Years' War, although I think there might actually be more to say, so maybe we'll have an extra one afterwards at the end.
Maybe Joan of Arc.
And the Battle of Verneuil, I can't pronounce it, but it seems like an interesting one to talk about as well, because it's... anyway, I'm getting off the subject already. 5 seconds in, and we're already distracting ourselves. Right, so after Poitiers, the French position collapsed. We had the Treaty of Brittany, and the French weren't happy with that, were they?
Yeah, no, they sort of essentially ripped it up within a year or two
Yes.
of it. There was like, you've got
Harsh terms they can't accept.
Yeah, it's an absurd set of...
It was a Roman treaty.
Yeah.
We've won the war, and we know we're going to keep winning, so
Right.
you're going to sign this and you're going to lump it.
Right. But there's basically a hiatus as far as sort of hot war goes in France. So the next big battle we're going to talk about is Agincourt, which is 1415.
Yeah.
So right away there you can see it's over 50 years later.
Yeah.
A whole lot goes down in that time.
Okay.
I mean, from the English point of view, when Edward III finally dies, as we mentioned in the last one, it should have gone to the Black Prince, but he died. He got some sort of terrible degenerative disease. We don't know what it was. He'd already died.
Yeah.
And so we
But
get
there's
into
much rejoicing around France at this point in time.
Yeah, you would have thought so. Yeah. One of their best
Mm.
generals has just died out of the blue. So
And then the other ones
it's
just died.
a
Brilliant.
boon
Yeah.
for them. Yeah, absolutely. And so the English get a bit of a succession crisis to some degree, and it's at this point where you can't avoid the sort of messy, having to look at a sort of quite a messy family tree.
Yeah.
And the name John of Gaunt comes up. People that know this period will be familiar with John of Gaunt. I don't want to muddy the waters too much with it because it's a bit complicated and not fantastically relevant to the Battle of Agincourt. But what you need to know is that it passes to the Black Prince's baby son. Well, I say baby, he was a small boy. He was 8 or 9 years old, a Richard. And so he rules what they say in your minority, basically a little boy. And so various of his advisors end up running the realm badly, and they end up getting killed by the mob.
Oh.
Or you end up with the Peasants' Revolt, with Wat Tyler and John Ball and all those great stories.
And this, if I recall correctly, was over a poll tax.
That was sort of the final straw.
Yeah.
It was the men of Brentwood, which isn't too far from where I sort of grew up and lived, Brentwood, in Essex. Anyway, they ended up murdering some of the king's closest advisors, including the Archbishop of Canterbury, I believe. Got his throat cut by a bread knife on Cheapside.
Bloody hell.
It's pretty, pretty lowly, ignominious way to go.
It's pretty serious, though, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
what happened? Well, we cut his throat. Okay, tell us how you really feel.
We'll do it with a bread knife, no less.
But poll taxes got Margaret Thatcher in trouble as well, didn't they? Like, there's a weird continuity in English history. It's just unfair to have poll taxes. People who don't earn money shouldn't pay tax. Seems reasonable. But anyway.
Well, just being unfairly levied against you.
Yeah.
Just for existing.
Yeah.
Taxes for being alive, basically.
Yeah.
To cut that short, Richard II's reign is he's quite often characterised as melancholy. He's not that bad to begin with, but he ends up being consumed by revenge because Parliament had some of his favourites murdered, and so he decided. It's a dirty, horrible reign, which we could go into another time, but could speak for a long time about that. In the end, at the Peasants' Revolt, he said he put them down with ferocity. He said, in the end, you'll have no captain but me, and I shall treat you incomparably harsher than you were ever treated before. Like, how dare you raise up against the crown?
Assert your rights, I guess.
Yeah, Richard II's pretty much a complete dick. You look back at it and you think, there's some people in history, it's like, you're acting like a dickhead, and then when everyone called you out on it, you just double down until you got yourself murdered.
Yeah.
You know,
Richard II's one of those.
Yes, definitely. And so when he ends up, being replaced by one of his own cousins, Henry Bolingbroke, who is Henry IV, Henry V's dad. Anyway, throughout nearly all this time and Henry IV's reign, there's not much going on in France in the 100 Years' War because they're having to deal with their own. There's quite a lot of problems going on within Britain. The Scots and the Welsh are both revolting, as usual. And so
Nothing new.
Henry IV's reign, just to quickly cut through this because we want to get to Henry V. Henry IV is a usurper, really.
Yeah.
He was just he was a senior member of the royal family, but he was a cousin. He wasn't an anointed king. He had Henry II arraigned, imprisoned, and then he died. We're not 100% sure why.
Yeah,
he was put into...
Like with all of these things, it dies in prison. Well, I mean, A, it's probably quite easy to die in a medieval prison. B, that could be a euphemism for murdered.
Yes, yeah. So he's imprisoned in Pontefract Castle, where other men hundreds of years before had also been imprisoned. And it seems he probably starved to death.
There we go.
Which is a horrible way to go, actually. I think it's really painful and really quite a horrible way to die, actually. But that was the end of the vengeful Richard II. And so you're left with Henry IV, and there's a Shakespeare plays of Henry IV, so it sort of starts coming to life. I've got one line here from a historian called Nicholas Vincent, and he says, quote, "The problem was that to many, after 1399, which is the year Bolingbroke, Henry IV took control, after 1399, no matter what harmony might have reigned within the House of Lancaster, this was simply the wrong family to lay claim to government." That's what a lot of people thought.
Now, and again, the reason this matters is because of the way that feudal politics works and the way that people think the king arrives at his position as the king, which ultimately is with the sanction of God. And so you literally can have the wrong family in government.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we're talking about the Plantagenet line here. So this is unbroken since sort of Henry II.
Yeah.
And Richard II was sort of completely legitimately in the unbroken line. And even though Bolingbroke, Henry IV is a cousin...
Not close
it's
enough.
Not, yeah, it's not...
got to be a lineal descendant.
He's not the anointed heir.
Yeah.
And so, again, I don't want to get into it too much, but all the sons of Richard III, it becomes important. So the Black Prince was the firstborn son. Then after that, there was a Lionel of Antwerp.
I haven't even heard of him.
Right, exactly. That's exactly the point I was sort of going to make, that he's sort of forgotten, and his heirs down through a girl, one of his daughters, go on to marry a family called the Mortimers. And anyway, their descendants, the Mortimers, have got a much more legitimate claim than Henry Bolingbroke, because Henry Bolingbroke comes down through John of Gaunt, the third son. Right. So the heirs of this Lionel of Antwerp, really, the Mortimers, really should be ahead of the House of Lancaster, of Henry Bolingbroke. So they try and keep that under wraps, and in the end, they ended up getting rid of them. And then there's more sons as well after John of Gaunt. There's two other sons, one of Edward of Woodstock. And anyway, the point is, it's a complicated, confused, big family tree. Yeah. And so when Henry Bolingbroke, Henry IV, becomes king, he has to put down the Scots. There's lots of trouble in Wales, the Marcher Lords of Wales. There's a guy called Owen Glendower. There's also
Owen
Percy
Glendower, it was always pronounced when I was reading about it. But no. Like, I really find this interesting because, as I recall, he had like a few thousand Welsh archers that essentially lived in the woods and the mountains, constantly harassing and ambushing English patrols and things like that. And obviously the English would march an army in, but then they'd just dissipate into the wilderness and they'd be a nightmare. But at some point, didn't they actually invade England?
They tried to, yeah.
That's mad.
Yeah.
So how many of them were there?
Oh, I don't know. It's not, the numbers aren't huge. Yeah, but a few thousand.
Yeah, it's only like 4,000 or 5,000 at most. It's like, you're not gonna take the whole kingdom with a couple of thousand men. Yeah. You know, what are you doing? You're not gonna take a castle with a couple of thousand men. You know, what are you doing? You know. But anyway, sorry, go on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And there's also the Percy family that are out there in the Welsh marches.
The Hotspurs.
So one of their main men at the time is Harry Hotspur.
How did he get that name again?
Hotspurs, it means you're quick on a horse.
Yeah, right, that's it.
So yeah, it's just simply that. It was a nickname, really, Hotspur.
It sounds cool.
It does, yeah.
You know.
No, absolutely. Yeah. And he was, the Percy families and Harry Hotspur were a real thorn in the side of Henry IV. And he sends his young son, the eldest son, because he's got 4 boys as well. But the eldest one is Harry, this Henry V, our hero for this story. And so he sends him out. Then there's a big battle in 1403 at Shrewsbury. It was because, as a Prince of Wales, already the heir to the throne is the Prince of Wales already by this point, and he is known as Henry of Monmouth. Still is now. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And he's Henry of Monmouth. Monmouthshire is that part of the world as well. And anyone that knows Agincourt knows that there's lots and lots of Welsh archers there.
Oh yes.
in a sense, the Welsh won that battle. Some people say, pro-Welsh people would say. And anyway, it all goes back to the beginning of his life, really, his connection with Wales. And one of the main things he tried to do, or did do, was prevent the Percys and Owain Glyndwr's factions from meeting up. And anyway, there's the Battle of Shrewsbury, which the royalist side win. But our young Henry V gets an arrow in the face. It seems like somewhere around here, just below the eye.
Yeah.
Bang, straight in his face, all the way into his head.
Yeah, can't have been pleasant.
It's obviously a life-threatening injury, and the surgeons, which is a kind way of saying it, developed some sort of tool in order to get the barbed arrow out of his face.
Yeah.
It would have been just really
very
terrible.
Painful.
Well, that's the tip of the iceberg. How you don't get an infection from it.
Pre-modern surgery was really gross and very unpleasant, and the less said about it, the better, frankly.
Even like 19th century dentistry and things is hellacious.
Yeah.
Let alone early 15th century facial surgery.
People forget just how recent that like modern anesthetics and painkillers are. Like within the last 100 years, like if you were born just 100 years earlier, it would be really bad for you.
Just a quick aside on that. I remember speaking to my classics teacher once when I was doing A-level and said, if you could live at any time, when would you say? Expecting her to say something like classical Athens. Or something. She said, I wouldn't want to live before modern toilets, flushable toilets and anaesthetics. Yeah. Any time before those have been invented, I'm not interested. Yeah. Right. Wow, okay. It's a really serious, very real answer.
Well, like we were talking about with the Roman legionary one, they had to give you heroin, basically, didn't they? Poppy milk or whatever it was. Right, because otherwise it was just unbearable pain. And it's like,
Well, a lot of time in the American Civil War, lots and lots of amputations. It's just a bit of wood to bite down on. Yeah. Maybe a few nips of whiskey. But that's it. That's all you're going to get.
Good luck.
Horrible. Yeah. And so somehow Henry V survived that injury, didn't get blood poisoning or anything, and had a scar on his face, and apparently was always quite sort of worried about people commenting on it, and always wanted to show one side of his face, which wasn't scarred. Yeah. Well, quickly, while we're just talking about his appearance, people would have seen probably the sort of famous portrait of him in profile with the bowl haircut, famous bowl haircut. Yeah. Just a quick word on that. It's so weird because people didn't seem to wear that haircut before or after.
Right. Okay.
But what it seems to be, he was very, very pious. And it's sort of a tip of the cap maybe to monkishness. But also, if you look at the Bayeux Tapestry, the original Norman knights had that weird haircut. Yeah. And so it's sort of a throwback to being sort of an 11th century horseman in the mould of the conqueror himself. But we're not sure exactly. But anyway, he had that sort of strange haircut.
But I like the way, how old is he at this point after the Battle of Shrewsbury?
He's still young. He's like, I think 16?
Yeah.
15 or 16, not old at all. Very young.
But it just seems to be playing into this stereotype of like grizzled English warrior kings. By the time he's 16, I've already got a massive scar on my face. So I took an arrow in there when I was 16. Okay, Mr. French King, let's have a conversation. There's just a weird sort of stereotype that plays out. But anyway, carrying on.
Well, there's another thing from here from Nicholas Vincent. I'll just read out. I think it's because it's interesting. It says quite a lot in one paragraph, just about what I've been talking about in the last few minutes. He said, quote, we must take a painful but necessary glance at the royal family tree. If what follows seems all too much like the plot of a Verdi opera without the charm of the music, or indeed like a list of the characters assembled from a Dickens novel with no real sense of what these people said or did, then such is the price that has to be paid for an understanding of English politics in the 15th century. This was the politics of the gang boss or the godfather, in which everybody was related to everyone else, and God help the person who forgot that their enemy was someone else's cousin or friend. Just as mafia bosses tend not to write their memoirs, so there is a risk that lacking personal details or disclosures, the great aristocrats of 15th century England fade into a monochrome blur. So many Percys, Beauforts and Somersets, accumulating wealth and notoriety, but with precious little save dull dates and events to distinguish between them.
That's exactly why I've never bothered to learn what really happened in the details. Because it's just like, right, okay, I've got another guy who's got the same name. It's just like the Carthaginian problem. They've got 10 names for the entire thing and for hundreds of years. And it's like, right, okay, well, I'll just assume, it is like monochrome is a good way of describing it. It's hard to pick them out.
No, definitely. I think that's the problem with all history when you want to look at it in more and more detail. You can just delve more and more, and there's more and more figures,
Oh, yeah.
more and more names, more and more dates.
Yeah.
Um,
But at least with the Romans and the Greeks, they all had different names. Like the Greeks have got a remarkable variety of names. The Romans have got a remarkable variety of names, especially like cognomens or whatever. Where you've got they might have similar names, but they've got an individual name that history recalls them as. So each individual figure has a separate name. So it's not shared by a bunch of other people. So it's like, okay, well at least I know who I'm talking about when I'm talking about, and like it gives them a bit more life and color. Whereas unlike with the Carthaginian and medieval ones, where it's another Harry. Oh. Okay, which one? This is the 7th one. Oh, brilliant. God, it's impossible.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.